Okay, good evening. Let me welcome you to the annual Robert P. Kogod lecture, which traditionally takes place during the annual philosophy conference at the Hartman Institute. And there's a reason for that, which I only recently learned. Bob Kogod had an intense interest in this philosophy conference because he believed that it would be the perfect forum for the encounter between the classical Jewish tradition and contemporary Israeli ideas and problems. And he thought the philosophers represent modernity. So I thought that would get a giggle. And that we would be best suited to discuss modern ideas together with classical sources and come up, hopefully, with some kind of integration of the past with the present and the future in a way that would be useful for contemporary Jewish life. So we want to thank him. He's not here this year. We want to thank him and also Daniel Hartman, the head of the Hartman Institute, for supporting this endeavor. This year, we're privileged to have Yossi Klein Halevi as our speaker. Of course, he needs no introduction, but it's traditional when someone needs no introduction to make a few remarks. I'll keep it light. He was born in Brooklyn in the early 1950s and early on developed a tendency for activism.
This is going to be a long introduction, I hear.
It's going to be very short, but I thought I would.
To 1950s.
Well, I promise it's short. His activist life found expression in many ways, I'm sure, but the one that struck me as memorable was when he was, 19 or 20, you decided to join a sit-in in Moscow outside the emigration office, which was apparently not processing Jewish applications for passage to Israel as speedily as you would have liked. And as a result, he was arrested and detained and was only sprung by happenstance or serendipity, as I understand it. So, although the rest of your life was apparent, I'm sure, just as exciting, probably less dramatic than going to a Moscow jail. As you know, and I won't belabor this, he's a journalist, a blogger. He is a founder, along with Imam Abdallah Antepli, of a program at the Hartman Institute called Muslim Leadership Initiative, which brings North American Muslims to Israel, to Jerusalem, to learn more about and in close contact with the Jewish tradition, the Muslim tradition, and as I understand it, the Christian as well. And on top of all that, he is, as you all know, an author, which brings us to tonight's presentation. He's going to tell us about his universally acclaimed book, Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation. You can probably all guess the part about reunited Jerusalem, but if you haven't read any reviews, then you will be eager to hear how they divided a nation. So I'm going to let Yossi fill you in on that. We're delighted to spend an evening with you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks very much, and good evening, everyone. My topic is how the Six-Day War transformed Israeli identity. And I'd like to focus on primarily two areas, and if there's time, perhaps a third, on the Israeli relationship to power, to land, and again, perhaps at the end, to faith and God. My relationship to this topic is, like I think some of you here of my generation, intensely personal. There's nothing abstract for me about the Six-Day War. It is the moment when my relationship with Israel begins in an organic way. 3 weeks after the war, at the age of 14, I came to Israel with my father. My father was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, and he had two brothers who had survived the war and were living in Israel. And he hadn't seen his two brothers since the Holocaust, but somehow, as soon as the Six-Day War ended, it became imperative for him to be here. He had to see his brothers, and there was this kind of collective intuition around the diaspora. Hundreds of thousands of Jews come to Israel that summer. And the summer of '67 is really the beginning of mass Jewish tourism, pilgrimage to Israel. And the reason I think for that is that Jews simply felt that summer the need to touch something of the radiance of Israel. That summer in Israel was the happy ending of Jewish history, or so we imagined. We were the victors not only of a particular war, but of all the wars, because the wars were over. It was obvious that the Arab world was not going to attack Israel anymore. It had learned its lesson. And Israel, as my 16-year-old cousin said to me that summer, Israel is the safest country in the world. And I was thinking of the essay that Fukuyama wrote after the fall of communism about the end of history. The summer of '67 was the end of Jewish history. It was the end, and we were privileged to reach the end and to see how the story turned out. And it turned out pretty much the way Jews had always imagined for thousands of years the story would culminate. Until the Six-Day War, Israel was a kind of experiment, felt tenuous. It was a small, largely agrarian land, besieged, without a special relationship with the United States. The U.S.-Israeli special relationship, for all the talk of shared values, begins with the Six-Day War, when Israel proves its military value to the U.S. Until then, there was no special relationship. In May 1967, I remember experiencing 3 consecutive shocks while following the events here vicariously from Brooklyn. And this was true for Jews around the diaspora. The first shock was that the genocidal threat against the Jewish people had not been exhausted by the Holocaust. And I remember watching on TV crowds of demonstrators in Cairo and Damascus chanting death to Israel. And the second shock was the worthlessness of international promises and guarantees. The Egyptian President Nasser orders UN peacekeeping forces that are separating Israel and Egypt to leave, and they simply pack up and leave without any deliberations in the Security Council. And the final shock was just how alone Israel was going to be, facing this genocidal threat. After the Six-Day War, Israel now seemed to be permanent, seemed to have finally attained its solidity. And that summer, I actually experienced something of my own Zionist empowerment physically. The photographs that I have of myself from that summer show a steady progression of empowerment. At the beginning of the summer, I'm short, very pale, a little pudgy, and I don't quite know how to stand and how to hold myself. I'm this in the pictures. And by the end of the summer, I have miraculously grown. It is the summer of my growth spurt. And I'm tan, of course, and wearing sandals, standing much more self-confidently, and almost Israeli. In fact, I tell my father that you go home and I'm staying. I'm going to stay here for high school, which seemed to me a perfectly reasonable idea. And my father said no, and I said yes, and you can imagine how that turned out. And I came back to Brooklyn that fall wearing a necklace with a bullet around my neck. And I was wearing a bullet because that's what teenage Israeli boys were wearing in the summer of '67. Well, let's think for a moment about what that bullet represents. In one sense, the bravado is understandable. Israel had just experienced a reprieve from its own mortality. And so there was this strutting, there was this sense of celebrating existence. And that's really my strongest memory of the summer of '67, was the Jewish people celebrating the fact that it was alive. And I came back to Brooklyn not only with a bullet around my neck, but with a pile of victory albums. There were instant victory albums the bookstores were packed with victory albums. And partly because I think Israelis needed to remind themselves that this had actually happened. And how did we actually pull this off? How did we move from acute vulnerability in May '67 to military mastery in June '67? And my relatives had bought me these albums. Every stop we went, the present was another one of these victory albums. And the idea, I think, was bring this back to the Jews in America and show them what Israel is all about. And the victory albums and the bullet around the neck are part, to my mind, of the same phenomenon, of an acute insecurity, an inability to internalize victory and to really come to terms in a comfortable way with power. People who believe that they're powerful don't need to wear a bullet around their neck. And so it was that deep insecurity at the height of our victory and euphoria that to my mind really in some ways most characterizes the inner life of Israelis and Jews in the summer of '67. The Jewish experience of the reclamation of power is in its essence a bipolar experience. We are a manic depressive people, and that is a direct result of our experience. Just consider the following dates that I'm going to pair a series of dates. 1945, 1948. May '67, June '67. June '67, October '73. We go from the abyss or the fear of the abyss to victory, back and forth. That is the founding emotional and psychological story of Israel. The Yom Kippur War puts a brake on the arrogance of the strutting, the celebration of power, the glorification of power. Just to give you two examples, the last military parade that is staged on Independence Day, every Independence Day since the founding of the state, we had a military parade. The last military parade is on Independence Day 1973, 6 months before Yom Kippur. After the Yom Kippur War, that ritual ends. And I happen to have been a student here during the Yom Kippur War. It was my 1 year abroad at Hebrew University after our demonstration in Moscow. And I came in the summer of 1973, obviously not knowing what was to come. So I was here that year. In fact, my Israeli biography is in some sense defined by the wars of Israel. I made Aliyah in 1982, in the summer of '82, the beginning of the Lebanon War, which was in a sense the anti-Six-Day War. That was the war when military threat, when the security threat not only failed to unite us, but was the reason for Israeli society tearing itself apart. And then I was drafted during the first Intifada, so that kind of completes my trajectory. And what I saw happening in the months after the Yom Kippur War was this deep sense of humility that was setting in among Israelis. And it had an expression, in addition to suspending the military parades, it had a long-term consequence in the way survivors were treated in Israeli society. Until the Yom Kippur War, survivors were regarded in some way as failures. Failed Jews, failed human beings, certainly failed Israelis. And there's something about the vulnerability that Israelis experienced. And my own theory is that the moment of shock came with those first images, and I remember seeing them on TV with Israelis, the images of Israeli POWs being paraded by Egyptians in front of the TV cameras. And suddenly our soldiers were helpless. And there was something in that moment that opened up a capacity for empathy and compassion for survivors that had been largely missing in the Israeli psyche until then. So the Yom Kippur War, for all of its many difficult consequences, did have some very positive psychological results. And nevertheless, we have retained, I would argue, a profound manic-depressive relationship with power, and we veer between May and June 1967 in our psychological makeup. And we're always, in some sense, asking ourselves, whether consciously or not, whether a particular challenge that we're facing here is a May 1967 moment or a June 67 moment. Is this a moment of our vulnerability or of our power? Prime Minister Netanyahu, to my mind, embodies this bipolar relationship with power almost more than any of our politicians. I saw him speak recently at Yad Vashem at the Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Day commemorations. And it was an extraordinary speech. He begins by saying that what the Holocaust proves is that the weak don't survive. Now think about that for a moment. The Prime Minister of Israel is standing at Yad Vashem on Yom HaShoah, and he is basically giving a speech based on social Darwinism. And then, so that's the first premise, is that the weak don't survive. And he then goes on to speak about how Israel is the answer to the vulnerability to the powerlessness of the Shoah, and we are now the high-tech superpower, the great success story of the Middle East. And then he shifts to Iran, and we are now back in May 67, in the same speech. And that inability to find a balance between May and June 67, I think characterizes Netanyahu acutely, but to some extent defines much of Israeli political discourse. Consider as well the relationship with Moshe Dayan in 1967 and 1973. And I'm thinking of Dayan because I just read a profile in one of the Hebrew dailies, a big profile of Dayan, basically portraying him, one of Israel's leading military historians, who basically portrays Dayan as the arch villain of the history of the IDF and the complete failure and a fraud. Dayan has absolutely no military credibility. He has had no successes. Now, think of the Moshe Dayan that I encountered in the summer of '67, whose picture was on keychains, on posters, on falafel kiosks. Everywhere you looked, there was Moshe Dayan. in Brooklyn, we experienced Moshe Dayan as our representative to the non-Jewish world. And in my doctor's office in Flatbush, in the fall of 1967, there was a floor-to-ceiling poster of Moshe Dayan in the waiting room. And what's even more extraordinary about this poster is no one seemed to think this was unusual. And so that was a Jewish doctor's office in the fall of 1967. Moshe Dayan in 1973 is the arch-villain of the Zionist story. He's personally responsible for the fall of 3,000 Israeli soldiers in Yom Kippur. He is responsible for all the failures. So we go from Dayan as a kind of a demigod, and I don't think that that's too much of an exaggeration, to then becoming the Antichrist of the Zionist story. So this deep sense of imbalance between May and June, between June 67 and October 73, this is the foundation, the very problematic foundation with which we then try to cope with the Palestinian problem. The Palestinian problem has profoundly disoriented us because, in a way, it feeds these contradictory perceptions, experiences, in the most drastic way. The Palestinians play a radically contradictory role in our imagination. Who are the Palestinians to us? Are they the stranger whom we are forbidden to oppress, the stranger in our midst, whom the Torah warns us more than any other injunction, warns us, don't oppress the stranger in your midst? Is that who the Palestinians are to us? Or are the Palestinians the competing claimant that seeks to disinherit us, that seeks to uproot us from here? And my answer is yes. What makes the Palestinian dilemma so wrenching for us is because the two lessons that Jews have learned from Jewish history, on the one hand, don't be brutal, don't treat the stranger as you were treated, and on the other hand, don't be naive. When your enemy tells you that they want to destroy you, believe them and act on it. Those two non-negotiable commandments of Jewish history converge on the Palestinians and define our relationship, our radically unbalanced relationship to how do we relate to this challenge. 1967 resurrected the temptation of political immaturity within the Jewish people. One of the great achievements of Zionism until 1967, between 1948 and 1967, was to teach the Jewish people political realism, how to handle power, how to take your place among the community of nations. And Zionism set out to free the Jews of the temptation of the politics of wishful thinking, the politics of Luftmenschkeit, if one can call it that. And just to think for a moment about how deeply the temptation of the politics of fantasy was rooted in the Jewish psyche. Go back to the vast numbers of Jews who became communists in the early 20th century, the ultimate political fantasy, which seemed to vast numbers of Jews a realistic political program. To say nothing of the fact that Jews, in many cases, were the last Stalinists. I knew Jewish Stalinists in Brooklyn in the 1960s. They were my cousins. And so Zionism set out to challenge this profound Jewish inability to function politically in the real world. 1967 comes along and upends for many Jews that sense of balance and realism. On the right, what we see among the settler leadership from the very beginning is a refusal to come to terms with the political consequences of forcibly absorbing several million Palestinians into Israeli society. When I was working on Like Dreamers and looking through the protocols of the meetings of the Yesha Council, the umbrella organization of the settlers group, going back to the 1980s, you can't find a serious conversation about what are we going to do about the Palestinians? How do we respond to the argument of the Israeli left about demographics, about Israel as a Jewish majority and democratic society? And one reason I think that there was simply an obtuseness, a refusal to seriously come to terms with that challenge is because if we are living in the Messianic era, then the demographic problem is something that the Messiah will take care of. There was a sense of deep lack of responsibility to having a politics in the real world because we had entered meta-history. We were no longer responsible for the normal rules of history. And this was a profound anti-Zionist outburst within Zionism. And there were those who saw this who saw Gush Amonim, the settlement movement, as an anti-Zionist phenomenon. Amnon Rubinstein, most prominently among them. In his book From Herzl to Gush Amonim, he identified Gush Amonim as anti-Zionist for precisely this reason. When I speak to right-wing Jewish communities in the States, what I often get is there's no occupation, there's no such thing as an occupation, and not only is there no such thing as an occupation, there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. The truth is you hear that less even on the Israeli right today, and the reason is because we know there's a Palestinian people because we live with them, and we know there's an occupation because we are occupiers. We actually experience that role. But what you'll hear among American Jewish right-wingers is there's no such thing as a Palestinian people because it's a contrived identity. To which my response is, of course it's a contrived identity. That's the definition of peoplehood. Any people is a contrived identity. In fact, that is what creates a people is that act of self-creation and definition. On the Jewish left, the Israeli left, the diaspora left, there's a different form of political immaturity that has set in, a different kind of denial of reality. And that is a denial less so in the mainstream Israeli left today, still on the radical Israeli left, and still within the mainstream diaspora left, American Jewish left, a refusal to come to terms with the depth of rejection of Israel's legitimacy within all parts of the Palestinian national movement and throughout the Arab and Muslim worlds, and the consequences of that rejection for the chances of reaching reconciliation. There is such a desperate need that the Jewish left feels for ending the occupation, that the temptation to overlook reality is often decisive. And what we've experienced here is that we've moved, I'd say the Israeli left, the mainstream left, has moved away from the formulation of land for peace. In our last couple of elections, no one but the Meretz Party spoke about peace. Labor Yesh Atid, rightward, simply did not promise the Israeli public peace because they knew that the Israeli public didn't believe it. Instead, the formulation that has taken hold is land for preserving Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Now, that has not fully sunk in, I think, in the diaspora left. On the fringes of Israeli society and American Jewry, what we've seen as a long-term destructive consequence of the Six-Day War is a resurrection of very problematic Jewish archetypes that seemed to have faded into Jewish history. In Israel in particular, we've seen the resurrection of the Zealots. And we see them in the Hilltop Youth, and it is a renewed pathological strain whose intensity we haven't really experienced since the Second Temple. In the diaspora, we have the phenomenon on the far left that was satirized by the Anglo-Jewish novelist Howard Jacobson in his novel, The Finkler Question, proud to be ashamed. And Jacobson invented a Jewish organization of left-wing British Jews who were proud to be ashamed of being Jewish. And so there's something in that dichotomy that is now back in Jewish discourse. And that too, the resurrection of deeply problematic Jewish archetypes, is a consequence of 1967. When did we begin? 7:35. Okay. How 1967 changed our relationship to land. Now, first of all, I think what needs to be said is why the settlement movement was so successful. Why it was so hard for Israeli society to resist this force for settlement. And I think that what we experienced in 1967 was a convergence of almost irresistible forces. The first was the fact that we returned to the heartland of Jewish history through a war of survival in a way that I don't believe any people in a way that we returned as justly as any other people ever returned to its ancient land in a war of survival, combined with the powerful appeals of history and religion and the security argument, which is being debated to this day in Israel. And to my mind, there are compelling arguments on both sides. The origin of the settlement movement, I think, is worth noting briefly. The first communities that Israel built over the Green Line in the summer and fall of 1967 were communities that had been destroyed by the Jordanians in the living memory of many Israelis, beginning with the Old City in Jerusalem. The next community is September 1967, Kfar Etzion, the kibbutz in the Etzion block, which was destroyed literally on the eve of Israel's declaration of statehood. And then 6 months later, in Hebron, the Jewish community that was destroyed in 1929. And I mention this because the origins of the settlement movement are not in the abstract longings to renew the biblical presence, but in the living memory of Israelis to renew communities that had been destroyed 2 decades earlier. or 5 decades earlier in the case of Hebron. And so these were forces that created this almost irresistible need on the part of many Israelis to cross that line. At the same time, the peace movement has also been powerfully successful, because from the very beginning, or certainly not with the creation of Kfar Etzion, but 6 months later, with the establishment of the Jewish community in Hebron, which is then moved in 1970 to Kiryat Arba. But almost from the very beginning, the peace movement emerges as a strong counterforce, so that from the beginning of the settlement movement, there is a deep debate in Israeli society, which of course continues to this day. And the ability of the peace movement, even in its lowest points, and we're certainly at one of those points today, to nevertheless draw a question mark over the viability, over the common sense of this settlement enterprise is, I would argue, one of its great successes. Though I would add parenthetically that the most significant divide in Israeli politics, in the end, when it really comes time to decide withdrawal, is never between left and right. It's between the pragmatic right and the ideological right, or the religious right. Every withdrawal that we have had since 1982 has every significant withdrawal has really been from the right, with the exception of Rabin's first withdrawals in 1975 with Egypt. So the story of our relationship to land is really the story of the transformation of religious Zionism from one of the most moderate movements within Zionism to one of the most militant. This transformation was not immediate in the aftermath. It was not immediately apparent in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. The first movement that's created to push for the annexation of the territories, the movement for the complete land of Israel, Hatnuah Leman Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, is founded primarily by men from the left, from the labor movement. Natan Alterman, the poet, the beloved poet of the labor movement, is the leading force in creating the movement for the complete land of Israel. Yitzhak Tabenkin, the head of the Kibbutz HaMeuchad movement, is one of the founders. And at the founding meeting, there's a young religious Zionist present named Yisrael Harel, who later on becomes the founder of the umbrella council of the settlement movement, the Yesha Council. And he's sitting among all of these luminaries, most of them of the left, with a few right-wing literary figures. Uri Tzvi Greenberg, the poet of the nationalist wing of Zionism, is present. And finally, Yisrael Harel very shyly offers a suggestion. And he says, there are many young people in my community of religious Zionists who I think would be interested in this movement. And there's a kind of quiet in the room, and people, you imagine people pondering the notion of religious Zionists who are really the chnunim. I'll translate that in a moment, but the chnunim of the Zionist movement, the nerds of the Zionist movement, really the most moderate force, that they would have anything to do with actually settling the new lands. This is a radical idea in the summer of '67. And so a few months later, we see the first settlements being created, and of course, this is founded by young religious Zionists. One of the most powerful stories that I came across as I was researching Like Dreamers was the moment 3 weeks before the outbreak of the war in the Merkaz Harav Yeshiva of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the son of the late Israeli chief rabbi Rav Kook. And on Yom Ha'atzmaut, on Independence Eve, May 1967, 3 weeks before the outbreak of the war, and before anyone even knows that there are events that are about to happen that will bring us to war, Rav Tzvi Yehuda stands before his students and begins to cry out in pain. Where is our Shechem, our Nablus? Have we forgotten it? Where is our Yericho, our Jericho? Where is our Hebron? Have we forgotten it? And he recalls the moment when partition is voted by the UN in November 1947, and how there's dancing in the streets of Jerusalem, and he's sitting in his room in mourning for the lost lands. And his students are listening to this, and they're in shock, because Rav Tzvi Yehuda has never before shared this moment with his students. Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day in Merkaz, is always a moment of religious celebration. Merkaz has staked out that place between the secular Israelis, for whom Independence Day is not a religious event. It is an expression of human initiative, and between the ultra-Orthodox community, for whom Independence Day is also not a religious event, for the same reason, because it is a usurpation by human beings of what God should have, a process that should have been in God's hands. And so, in Merkaz, Independence Day is a profoundly religious moment. And here is Rav Tzvi Yehuda destroying the celebration. And 3 weeks later, many of those young people who were in that room are in uniform, standing at the wall, standing on the Temple Mount, or in Jericho, Shechem, and Hebron. And that is the moment that transforms religious Zionism. The Merkaz Harav Yeshiva, until that moment, was a peripheral institution within religious Zionism. Now it becomes central, with the ideology, the messianic ideology of the Kookians. If Rav Tzvi Yehuda was speaking prophecy, and his speech, by the way, becomes sanctified in religious Zionist circles as Mizmor Yud Tet, the 19th Psalm, 19th because it is Israel's 19th Independence Day, and it takes on the sanctity, the weight of a psalm. If Rav Tzvi Yehuda was speaking directly from God, then how is it possible to ever give up those lands? And Rav Tzvi Yehuda says so explicitly in the summer of '67 at a celebratory gathering in Merkaz a few weeks after the war, in which he announces that no government, no democratically elected government, is permitted to withdraw from the territories because those lands do not belong to any one generation of Jews. Even if a majority of Jews were to decide to give up the territories, they have no right to do so. And he posits the Knesset Yisrael, which is a mystical concept of the collective souls of Israel, all the souls of Israel that were ever born and that will ever be born, against the Knesset, the political, mundane Knesset of the Jewish people. Now, in the 1980s, a few prominent rabbis begin to push back. Rav Ovadia Yosef comes up with his famous Psak Halacha, his legal ruling, where he says that for the sake of saving lives, one is permitted to withdraw from Holy Land. Rav Yehuda Amital, coming from within the heart of the settlement movement, stuns the religious Zionist community during the Lebanon War of 1982, when he says that the wholeness of the people of Israel takes precedence over the wholeness of the land, and in order to preserve Jewish unity, one is permitted to withdraw from land. So these are utilitarian ideas. These are really utilitarian justifications for withdrawing from sacred land. What I've learned here at Hartman is that there is a deeper religious justification for sharing the land with the counterclaimant, with the Palestinian people, and that has to do with the very essence, the very nature of the sacred. The sacred land, by definition, cannot be owned by human beings. That is the meaning of Shemitah, of every seventh year letting go of the land. That's the meaning of Yovel, of Jubilee. And that, for me, is really, in some sense, a religious justification, one could almost say an imperative, for accommodating the counterclaim to this land. That is honoring the sanctity of this land. So let me make a few comments about the final point, and then we'll open for conversation. And that is how 1967 has changed the relationship to God, to Judaism, Jewish identity. Consider the self-evident but nevertheless stunning fact that pre-1967 Israel did not contain a single significant Jewish holy site. There were significant Christian holy sites in pre-67 Israel, but no major Jewish holy sites, which is to say that the landscape of the state of Israel reflected the secular Zionist ethos, which was seeking to decouple the state of Israel from a deep relationship with Judaism, with religiosity. 1967 is that moment when we re-encounter the secular landscape, and as a result of which Judaism becomes an inseparable part of Israeli identity, where it remains to this day. In the culture war in the early years of the state could be defined only half facetiously as a war between the Israelis and the Jews. With 1967, and this we see really only in retrospect, the Jews win. Jewishness, Judaism, is now an essential part of, for better and for worse, of Israeliness. The transformative moment is the morning of June 7th, 1967, when the paratroopers reach the wall. Paratrooper Brigade 55, about 50% secular kibbutzniks, about 70% of the officers' corps kibbutzniks. And the image that takes hold, the mythic image that moves through the Israeli public, is of the paratroopers, the kibbutznik paratroopers, weeping at the wall. And one of the questions that I asked myself when I was working on Like Dreamers is, why did the paratroopers go down from the Temple Mount to the wall? In order to reach the wall from where they were coming through the Lion's Gate, they were coming from the east, the Via Dolorosa, you had to cross the Temple Mount in order to go down to the wall. Matagur announces the Temple Mount is in our hands. And yet the paratroopers come to the mount, and the first question they ask, including the religious paratroopers, is, where's the wall? How do we get to the wall? And I asked, for example, Hanan Porat, who went on to become the founder of the settlement, the founder of the settlement movement, and who later, as a Knesset member, established the parliamentary lobby to permit Jewish prayer on the Mount. I said, you were there on June 7th. Why did you go down? And he said, I don't know. And my sense is that the collective intuition of the paratroopers at their moment of victory was to touch something of the place where Jews had prayed in their powerlessness for that moment. And it was a moment of almost surrender to something greater than 20 years of Israeli history or 90 years of Zionist history at that time. It was a surrender to the missing 2,000 years that secular Zionism had tried to erase from Jewish history. That's the moment when those years return. My father had a very powerful moment at the wall, and I experienced it with him. But before I share that moment, I'll tell you something about his relationship with Judaism. He grew up in a quite Orthodox family. His father was very close to the Satmar Rebbe. And after the war, my father left Judaism completely. And the way that he explained it to me was that God did not deserve Jewish prayer. That's a really Jewish way of turning against God. And it's not simply, and my father did not stop believing in God. Quite the opposite. God was God. God could have stopped the Holocaust. And because he didn't, therefore I'm going to boycott God. It was BDS against God. And it's a whole story, as these things always are. My mother made it as a precondition of their marriage that my father would live an observant life. And she said to him, I don't care what you believe, but we will live, quote, a proper Jewish life. So he re-inhabited the moves of a Jewish religious life, but without any of the conviction, and it was quite subversive, and he let me know from a very early age that I don't believe this, I don't expect you to believe it, and if you don't do this when you're a teenager, we'll be okay with that. And so now I'm a teenager, I'm 14, and I'm standing with him at the wall, and he turns religious on me. And at the wall, my father says, now I forgive God. And he became a deeply praying Jew till he died. He became a genuine, not a practicing religious Jew, but a genuine religious Jew. And so that summer is really the summer when I think for many Jews, God becomes an option again. And it's as if, my father says to himself in the summer of '67, it's possible for me to not only question the faithfulness of God, but I can also question the faithlessness of God. And if it made sense for Jews to reject God after the Shoah, maybe it makes sense for us to reconsider our relationship. So God returns to the Israeli story. God returns to the life of many Jews. And, I've asked myself, why didn't that happen in 1948? And I think the reasons are fairly obvious. 1948, first of all, was too close to the Holocaust, and the shock was not yet processed. And the argument of the Zionists in 1948 was very compelling, which is that we created a state because we stopped waiting for God to give us a state. So that 1948 represents exactly what the ultra-Orthodox said it did, a revolt against God's authority. 1967 is the reintroduction of the possibility that this story may be miraculous, maybe, and that the ingathering of the Jews from 100 countries and the restoration of Jewish power after the lowest point of our history may, in fact, be what believing Jews in the past, I think, would have recognized it to be, as a divine act. I have too many more pages of notes, but I'm going to end here, and maybe some of this can come through in our conversation. So let's open for conversation.
Yossi has asked me to moderate this conversation, which is what I will do. So, who would like to lead with the first question?
Michael already has his.
Ah, okay, Michael.
So we are spending a week here talking about the '67 war and its consequences, and you have given a very powerful description of the effects it had, and it all sounds as if it is peculiar to that moment and to our history. But the appearance of the people you call zealots and the revival of religious belief that you described isn't a Jewish phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. And the same or a very similar kind of zealotry has appeared at roughly the same time among Hindus in India, most unbelievably among Buddhists, certainly among Muslims across the Muslim world, and among Jews. And so maybe even without the war, we would have had something like this. It may be significant that Cook's speech came 3 weeks before the war. Is this a phenomenon peculiar to us, or is it something that we need to address in a much more global way?
Well, I would say both simultaneously. We need to understand the peculiarly Jewish circumstances that created our outbreak of zealotry, of a return to faith. But at the same time, I very much agree with you. We need to see this in a wider context as well. One of the most important books for me, and really a kind of a strong influence for me in working on Like Dreamers, was Fuad Ajami's The Dream Palace of the Arabs, which is just a fantastic kind of a literary. It's really a literary intellectual history of how the Arab world tried to cope with modernity, and he focuses on a few writers and poets and thinkers in the Arab world, and there are very strong parallels with a kind of longing for a romantic history, the golden era, with the outbreak of the longing for the glory of the Davidic kingdom that happened in religious Zionism, which was not at all a part of mainstream religious Zionism until '67. So whether there are trends in history that kind of sweep through all of us and take particular coloration, or whether this is a coincidence, maybe that's a religious question. I don't know.
Meirav, I believe you're next.
Thank you very much. I was struck by the extent to which your story is a story of an American at that point in your life. And we spoke at one point in the discussion yesterday, I think, about the, so someone raised a question about the relationship of American Jews to the settler movement. And I'm just wondering what your take on that would be as someone who experienced 1967 as an American, and where you think that comes from. So.
Well, it's interesting because the diaspora that was most transformed by the Six-Day War was actually the Soviet Jewry. The Six-Day War is the precise moment when large numbers of young Jews re-inhabit a Jewish identity that they don't understand, that they know nothing about. And Sharansky has this wonderful moment in his autobiography, Fear No Evil, where he writes about his joy in hearing that Israel had conquered the Temple Mount, and he said, but I didn't know what the Temple Mount was. I was just happy that Israel had it. And so Soviet Jewry, the year before the Six-Day War, Elie Wiesel goes to the Soviet Union and writes his account of his journey among the Jews there, and he calls it the Jews of Silence. After the Six-Day War, that notion is already obsolete, because growing numbers of young Soviet Jews are in active revolt against the Soviet Union. So in America, I think that American Jews, and here I'll go back to Michael, to your point about looking at other trends. What I remember experiencing, along with my friends in the late 60s, was the late 60s in America. And it was all converging. It was the Six-Day War, it was the Summer of Love. And I remember the summer of being in Israel in the summer of 67, remember reading about the Summer of Love in San Francisco in Time magazine. And I was just torn. I was saying, I wish I could have been there, but I'm really happy to be here. But it's really all the same somehow, because it's all part of this same almost messianic phenomenon. The old order is being upended. That was the experience of 1967. That was certainly the experience for many of us in the late 60s. Now, I ended up in the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, in the late 60s. That's where I took all of this, and very much in the kind of anti-messianic or anti-utopian movement in the Jewish community. But the JDL was that expression of wannabe Israelis. We wanted to share in something of the glory of the Six-Day War. The JDL, I would argue, parenthetically, was an expression of how the Six-Day War not only made many American Jews more proud of being Jewish, and sometimes in a vulgar way, but in many ways in a profound way as well. But the Six-Day War, I believe, also made American Jews more self-confident Americans. And I would add, just as an aside, that the JDL was a very American expression. It was an expression of my generation becoming comfortable in America, because previous generations of American Jews would have never acted as badly publicly as we did. We allowed ourselves to I remember when a JDLer would go to jail, whether you were Orthodox or not, you kept a kippah in your pocket and you put the kippah on in the paddy wagon, because that was an expression of your Jewishness. And so we were not afraid of America. We weren't afraid, and I remember my parents saying, how can you do this? The FBI is coming around the house, and they were terrified. But we knew that this was America. And so we trusted the safety of America. And this is all part of a very complicated post-Six-Day War process in which American Jews become more Jewish and more American. In terms of the settlement movement, I would not overstate the significance of American settlers. I know there's a book that's just come out that makes the case that that the American presence in the settlement movement is crucial. I think that their presence tends to be overstated because when foreign journalists come to a settlement, they're the ones who get interviewed. Nevertheless, I certainly see a connection between how my friends and I responded to the Six-Day War in the JDL to the Americans going to the settlement movement.
So, next is Omri, I believe. And Cliff, did you have your hand up?
Thanks. I have two questions. I'll do this briefly. One is the May 67, June 67 question. Just in general, I'm aware of the sentiments that were present in Israel and in the diaspora among Jews, and not just Jews. But I'm asking about their correspondence to reality and how we see this correspondence today. The reason I'm asking is that, as you mentioned, we're still shifting between the May 67, June 67. I think that some people might think that when, say, Netanyahu is invoking this swing, he's lying or invoking a myth. To a certain extent, it was a myth already then. Israel was you called it a small agrarian country, but also a nuclear power.
A nuclear agrarian.
Yeah. But in 67, some people sometimes make the argument that a country with a bomb cannot be destroyed. So a reflection on that would interest me. That's one comment. The other comment is about the so-called, I will call it, the so-called demographic problem. I'm uncomfortable with the demographic problem, I think. It's not a good language to adopt, I think. But it's obviously the language that we are adopting today in Israel as, among other things, the main argument for peace. You mentioned that in the discussion, the early discussions of the settlers, they were not responsibly thinking about the demographic problem. They were caught with messianic language. A miracle happened to them, and they were not responsibly politically thinking about the demographic problem. I want to mention that there was a demographic problem and a miraculous solution to it already in 48. However you're going to tell the story of 48, there was a demographic problem, and it was miraculously solved. I'm not sure when people started actually calling it a miracle, later to be replaced with a Nakba or not. I'm not sure when people actually started calling it a miracle, but it was treated as such. Israel would not have been a Jewish and democratic state in the 48 borders if 700,000 Palestinians did not leave. My question is, and I think you probably know as well as I do, probably much better than I do, there is now slowly a return of the question of whether that miracle is going to happen again in the 67 borders. Call it a miracle or a Nakba, there is a chance that those settlers, whether consciously or not, knew that under some constellations, those miracles can happen. And that a demographic problem also within the 67 borders, that is including the 67 borders, could be resolved. How much do you think this have room in those circles today? How do you think that Israeli secular Jews would be able to resist it consciously or not? Whatever your reflections might be.
Well, let's deal with the first question in terms of Israel as a nuclear power. We don't know in 1967 what the extent of Israel's nuclear capability was. The assumption is there was at least one or two working bombs of some capacity. But when all that stands in the end in a country's perception, or in its leader's perception, between annihilation and survival is using the bomb, that gives you very little leeway for survival. And so I saw the New York Times' piece the other day based on Avner Cohen's expose, and I was personally not impressed. I didn't feel that this changes the emotional landscape of 1967 in any significant way, including for Israel's leaders, even given that they had that last resort option to have to make that decision to detonate a nuclear bomb means, in some sense, you're already at the cliff.
The bomb was not metaphorical, but it was an example. Israel was a major military power. Israel's leaders were, of course, aware of this. I'm thinking of a scenario like Tom Segev's 1967. It's a scenario in which Israel's generals push for war because they know that they will destroy all the Arab militaries around. This is well documented. I don't doubt for a second your sentiments, my parents' sentiments here in Jerusalem, they existed. But the leadership seems to have known well that Israel was not under an existential threat.
Yeah, that is a position I deeply disagree with. I deeply disagree with Tom Segev's portrayal of reality here in 1967. And Levi Eshkol, the prime minister, asks IDF chief Yitzhak Rabin, are we going to win the war? Rabin says, yes, we'll win, but there will be devastating casualties. So this notion that the generals were pushing for war because they thought that it was going to be the victory that it turned out to be, or something like it, I think is more in retrospect than reality. Yitzhak Rabin's nervous breakdown before the war is, I think, indicative of the kinds of pressures and fears that went through the upper echelons. Eshkol's back and forth, Eshkol's hesitations about what to do in 1967 had a lot, I think, were also a reflection of this acute anxiety that existed in the leadership. So this notion that we were a major power, we felt that we were a major power, I don't buy it. And the only way that Israel could win a war was by entirely mobilizing its society, so that the Israeli economy came to a standstill, which was not, of course, true in the neighboring countries, which means that if this had continued for another month or so, the Israeli economy would have collapsed. That's very much in the minds of the leadership as well. And Segev and others who bring this kind of revisionist version of 1967 really are glossing over what it took for Israel to win, which again is the total mobilization of Israeli society. In terms of the demographics and the demographic threat, I agree with you with, I'm also very uncomfortable with speaking about people as a demographic problem. And that's something that left, right, and center in this country take for granted. And it's worth mentioning that when we speak about our neighbors as a demographic problem, that in itself is a moral problem. And it's a reflection, I think, of a deeper problem. Now, in terms of the flight, expulsion, half flight, half expulsion of Palestinians in 1948 as being seen as a miracle, I've heard that language being used, but not in a religious sense. And when I was invoking miracle, I meant it in a literal religious sense. That is how many Jews perceived 1967. The flight of the Palestinians was not seen as a miracle in that way. And if it was used in that, if that language, when that language was invoked, it was more metaphorical or ironic, I think, than anything else. When the settlement movement begins, you don't see even subliminally, you don't see a longing for 1948, except with Mayor Kahana. Kahana comes from, my old leader comes from the United States in 1971 and creates a movement which speaks explicitly about 1948 as the model for solving our problem in the territories. But Kahana is treated by Gush Amunim as a kind of a laughable figure, a galut figure, an exilic figure, someone he's not one of us. And there's no need for the founding generation of settlers to indulge in that kind of fantasy, because they have another fantasy, which is that the Messiah is coming imminently. And there's no reason for us to worry about what to do with the demographic problem. I see a change in the settlement movement today, in settlement circles, and there is definitely more of a willingness to accept Kahana's option as legitimate. I was walking around the streets on Yom Yerushalayim a couple weeks ago, and I saw a fair number of young people with knitted kippot wearing stickers, Kahana Tzadak, Kahana was right. That's now part of the language in certain circles. And in terms of secular Israel, I think that it would really depend on the circumstances. If we found ourselves in an existential moment, again, whether 1948 or 1967, and I do see both those moments as existential, then a society tends to lower its red lines when it's facing that kind of threat. And is another expulsion possible? Sure, it's possible. But again, depends on the circumstances.
Okay, let me tell you what the queue is now. It includes first Shaul Magid, then Cliff Orwin, David Luban, a gentleman whose name I don't know, Moshe, okay, and Miriam. So, Shaul, you're up.
Thank you, Yossi. I may be the only one who has actually heard this before, but this is actually a better version than the diaspora version than I heard a few weeks ago.
Yeah, this is the Israeli version.
This is the Israeli version. So I wanted to ask you.
There's always one in the audience.
I wanted to throw out three other responses to get your reaction of 67. One is the response of the Satmar Rebbe. One is the response of Ernst Akiva Simon, and one is the response of Ben Gurion. The Satmar Rebbe said something actually quite interesting after 67. He said, I don't really understand. All of these Jews who don't believe in anything, all of a sudden are talking about miracles. Ernst Akiva Simon said, I too would believe that the Six-Day War was a miracle if I didn't believe in God so much. And Ben Gurion, very, very quickly, not talking about the language of miracle, but very, very quickly saw that something was wrong. The fact is, by the time that happened in 67, Ben Gurion was already so much of an outlier in Israeli society for all kinds of reasons, political reasons, that nobody really paid attention to him. Of course, Leibovich comes up with that very quickly afterwards. So my interest is really the Satmar Rebbe and Ernst Akiva Simon, because a lot of the Jews who actually were deeply believing Jews did not think it was a miracle. So it was really the miracle for the minimalist believing Jews, or the non-believing Jews. It was the great miracle of the secularists. Now, of course, there were many Jews that were believing Jews but your father, for example, right? That was enough to forgive God. But it could be that the miracle was precisely the problem. That the miracle, the fact that it was interpreted that way got us to where we are today. Because nobody paid attention to Ben Gurion. Right? And I'll also, it is true that even though the Satmar Rebbe kept his position and wrote this incredibly, in my mind, crazy but very rich response to the Six-Day War, his Al Geula Val Tamura, most of the Haredi community began to soften its position slowly after 67. But the language of miracle is really a very problematic language because it really creates the legitimacy for an irrational and unethical, to some degree, response to this particular act that happened.
I think that's exactly right. Well, I'll take a step back. Let's start with the Satmar Rebbe. So at the end of the Six-Day War, I went with a group of my friends to the Satmar Yeshiva in Borough Park, where we lived, with an Israeli flag, and we sang the Hatikva as if it was like the Syrian embassy. And it was this sense of gloating, and it was very personal, for my father, who would come from Satmar land, and just hated the Satmar Rebbe. So I was kind of acting out his grudge, and so in terms of what I didn't understand then, I wouldn't have been able to express it this way, but I still don't understand now, are Haredim who, if they find a dollar bill on the street, will say this is hashgacha pratit, But the ingathering of the exiles, the restoration of Jewish sovereignty, that. Who knows? Who knows what it is? I don't know. Maybe it's from God. Maybe it's not from God. So either everything is from God or nothing is from God. I love Ernest Simon's formulation because really what he's saying is everything's from God. That's how I understand what he's saying. Everything's a miracle, and if everything's a miracle, nothing's a miracle because life is a miracle. So why are you singling out this and interpreting this to lead to certain political conclusions, which is exactly the problem that you're raising. But, if we're going to be fair to sort of the inner dynamics of Judaism, we have a problem here because one way that Judaism tests the presence of God is in history. Judaism doesn't just look to nature for proof of God's existence. It looks to history, in particular to Jewish history. And what do you do when you have a series of events that seem to confirm to how this was supposed to play out? And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, what do you do when you have 2,000 years of the hiddenness of God's face, culminating in the ultimate moment of God's hiddenness in the Holocaust? So you have these. So is God here? Is God not here? Which God are we celebrating? Is it the return of the biblical God, the God of miracles, of overt miracles, or is it the God of the rabbis, which is the God of hiddenness and, the God of the Hartman Institute, Lo Bashamayim, right? So which God are we really celebrating? And I think in the end, it's an argument about is this the biblical God or is this the rabbinic God? And of course, David Hartman comes along in revolt against the religious Zionist community's return or reinstating of the biblical God in Israel, and says, no, that's not the God that we need, especially now, with the temptation of a return to biblical times. But my sense, and I'll speak now personally as a religious Jew, I feel very much torn between the God of revelation and the God of hiddenness. I think that in some ways is what this time in Jewish history is about religiously, for me.
Very quickly, just a sentence. The Satmar Rebbe has actually a nice response to that. His response is, according to the rabbis, the golden calf was also a miracle, right? And that the Jews gave themselves over to it because they saw that it miraculously came out of the fire. So miracles can be, miracles can be, anyway.
I always thought that was Aaron's contrived excuse to excuse his fecklessness as leader. Okay. Next in the queue is Cliff.
I wonder if you could address directly a question which, in a way, you've addressed indirectly. For an American teenager like myself, the triumph in that war was the triumph of secular Zionism, right? As personified, above all, by Moshe Dayan. You have this small, mostly agrarian country with a shaky economy, but whose agrarian youth are also the shock troops of this amazingly successful modern military, right? Above all, is embodied in the Air Force, the most modern of military wings, that wins this shattering victory. Yet labor, which had governed Israel without serious rivals for 20 years prior to the war, is out by 1977. Admittedly, a lot had happened in between, such as the 73 war. But I wonder, what would one say about the implications of this triumph for secular Zionism, again, whose greatest moment it would seem to be? Is it in part, at least, that, as you suggested, it was somehow too big a phenomenon for secular Zionism to comprehend? That in a way it disclosed the superficiality of secular Zionism as to capture the significance of these millennia of Jewish history? Or was it something else? Or was it mostly accidental that 10 years later secular Zionism finds itself out of power and with gets back in subsequently only with difficulty?
The story the deeper story that interested me in researching my book on the paratroopers of '67 was not just the left-right divide that emerges in '67, but the struggle between, almost a kind of a metaphysical struggle between the kibbutz and the settlement. That these are the two utopian, messianic forces within Zionism. And 1967 is that moment, which again we see only in retrospect, where the utopian kibbutz is declining and the religious messianic settlement movement is rising in its place. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the first settlement is actually a kibbutz. Kfar Etzion, founded in September '67, is the missing link, the evolutionary missing link between the settlement the kibbutz movement and the settlement movement. And the reason that I wrote a book about these two movements is because one way of telling the Israeli story, especially after '67, but I think all the way through, is really as the story of the fate of the vast dreams that we brought with us and imposed on this small, besieged, overheated country. And these vast dreams of Jewish history, whether it was the secularized messianism of the early kibbutz movement, which was that the world would be transformed by the return to Zion through the creation of a laboratory for democratic communism. We would create the first real democratic communism, and we did. And then being challenged implicitly, and then finally explicitly after the Yom Kippur War, by the more traditional messianic ideas embodied by the settlement movement. So 67 several things happen to the kibbutz movement as a result of 67. And I'm going to focus on the kibbutz movement and answer your question about secular Zionism, because that's the most vital part of certainly left-wing secular Zionism, and that's that's the place where you see the decline and the crisis after '67 most acutely. So first of all, on the kibbutzim of HaShomer HaTzair, the Marxist wing of the kibbutz movement, there is this rage that is expressed by the soldiers coming back home from the front. And what they say to their parents is, your Soviet Union killed our friends. It was the Soviet Union which, until the Six-Day War, is still considered to be a force for good on HaShomer HaTzair kibbutzim. This is the big crisis in the summer of '67 for HaShomer HaTzair. And it's astonishing. You know, one of the paratroopers that I write about from Kibbutz Ein Shemer, HaShomer HaTzair kibbutz. In fact, HaShomer HaTzair was founded on Ein Shemer, or Kibbutz HaArtzi rather. The kibbutz wing of HaShomer HaTzair is founded in 1927 on Ein Shemer. And in the fall of '67, Avital Geva comes back. He'd been wounded in the war, and he comes back, and he's in charge of the orchards of Ein Shemer. And together with his friends, he decides to name the paths and the orchards after Soviet leaders, to mock kind of the pomposity of the infatuation with the Soviet Union. So there's Brezhnev Boulevard is one of the paths, and Red Army Square, you know, big signs. And the next Shabbat, when the kibbutzniks are wandering through the orchards, this is what they see. And so there is this rage, this revolt, and it's deeper than a disappointment in the Soviet Union. It's the sense of, how could we have been such fools to mistake our worst enemies for our friends? And then internalizing the crimes of Stalin as not just being the crimes of one leader, but systemic. And if we were so wrong, if our parents were so wrong about that, how do we know what they're right about? And so there's this collapse of faith. And when I say faith, I literally mean faith. One of Avital Geva's friends, Avishai Grossman, who was really one of the leading kind of younger intellectuals in the 50s and 60s of HaShomer HaTzair, says to me one day when I was interviewing him, and I had mentioned to him that I'd written a book about a journey that I took into Sufi Islam. And so very shyly, he says, you know, I had an experience, and I've been wanting to ask somebody who might know about this kind of phenomenon what happened to me. Yom HaAtzmaut, I think it was Israel's 10th anniversary, Avishai Grossman is part of the Hora, they're dancing through the night in Ein Shemer, and he says, I suddenly left my body. I had an out-of-body experience. On Yom HaAtzmaut in Kibbutz Ein Shemer, supposedly the most secular institution in Israel, and Avishai Grossman encounters his soul. And he says to me, what was that? Was that something like the Sufis? And so it was just this very touching moment when you realized that they had created such an intensity that the only experience you can compare it to is mysticism. And so HaShomer HaTzair loses its faith in the summer of '67. Now, what's happening more broadly throughout the kibbutz movement, including in the Ichud, which is the social democratic wing of the kibbutzim, including the Me'uchad, which had already gone through its disillusionment with the Soviet Union in the 50s. What's happening across the kibbutz movement is this, among the young people, is this sense of shame. Okay, we brought this great victory, but now we're conquerors. we're the children of the egalitarian dream, and we've just delivered this conquest to Israel. Now, the moment when that's expressed most acutely is in Siach Lochamim, the book that comes out about only 4 or 5 months after the war. Siach Lochamim is translated into English as the seventh day, and it's this outpouring of angst on the part of the kibbutzniks who come back from the war, and it's this first indication that there's something unsettled among the kibbutzniks. The most interesting moment that I see in this changing of the guard, where the religious Zionist young people suddenly feel that their ideology has been vindicated by the Six-Day War, and the kibbutzniks feel that their ideology has been thrown into doubt by the Six-Day War. That moment happens in a Jerusalem apartment in the summer of '67, when several kibbutzniks who are part of the Siach Lochamim team, which was created by there was a literary magazine of the Kibbutz Movement called Shtemot. Amos Oz was one of the editors, and they initiate this project of going around and interviewing kibbutzniks who had fought in the war, and they decide to make one exception. There's one group that they're going to include in Siach Lochamim who are not kibbutzniks, and that's the students of Merkaz Harav. And the reason they decide to include them in this very internal kibbutz conversation is because they had served with them in the elite units, and the kibbutzniks were very impressed by the quality of these young people. They said, they're like us. They're quality Israelis. They're not like the unwashed masses. These are quality Israelis. Their Hebrew is good. They have a finely honed ethical sense. And there were very interesting moments after the battle for Jerusalem when there was widespread Israeli looting in East Jerusalem. And those who stopped the looting were the kibbutznik paratroopers together with the religious Zionist paratroopers. They felt this was a violation of the victory and a desecration, really, of their friends' memories. So in the summer of '67, the team that's putting together Siach Lochamim come to the Kiryat Moshe neighborhood in Jerusalem, where Merkaz Harav is located, and they have a meeting with Yoel Ben Nun and Yochanan Fried and others who go on to become founders of the settlement movement. And this is the moment of mutual incomprehension, because the kibbutzniks are sitting there pouring their hearts out and saying, we feel devastated by the victory that we brought. And the religious Zionists are sitting there saying, are you out of your minds? We're now in meta history. Great days are coming. And the kibbutzniks decide not to include this conversation in Siach Lochamim. So it's very interesting. When you look at Siach Lochamim, at the beginning they have a list of all of the communities that they visited who were for interviews, and all of them are kibbutzim, with the exception of Merkaz Harav, and they're listed up front, but there is no trace of that conversation in Siach Lochamim. And so that's really the moment of the divide within the Messianic utopian camp. And I would divide Zionism into two camps. There's the Zionism of exceptionalism and the Zionism of normalization. And in the Zionist camp of exceptionalism, you had the kibbutzim, not necessarily anymore, and you had Merkaz, you had religious Zionism. Now, what's really interesting as well, this is just a final comment about this, in this conversation between the Merkaz students and the kibbutzniks in the summer of '67, there's this fascinating moment where one of the kibbutzniks turns to the Merkaz students and says, but doesn't Judaism say to us that we need to respect human life even if it's our enemies? And one of the Merkaz students say, any nation in our place would behave exactly as we did. So you have this sudden turn where the supposedly secular kibbutzniks are speaking in the name of Jewish exceptionalism, and the Merkaz students who revel in this idea of Jewish chosenness are insisting on the right to behave as badly as anyone else. And I think that to some extent, that moment has characterized much of the debate between left and right, ironically, between left and right in Israel since then.
That may be one of the top 5 answers I've ever heard to any question. Okay, the list now includes David, Moshe, and Shlomit, and if there's time for any more questions, I will entertain them. So, David.
It seems to me one thing that is completely missing from your story of 1967 is the Arab-Israeli citizens. And I've got really two complementary parts of it. When you said, there was this sense among the Jews of Israel, we've now entered into meta-history, and this moment of exaltation and miracle, I mean, that can't have been good for their attitudes toward their Arab fellow citizens, I would guess. But but you have talked with them and know whether 67 made a change in the attitudes of Israeli Jews toward Israeli Arab fellow citizens. And the complementary question is do you have any sense about what the Israeli Arab citizens were thinking in May and June? I mean, in May, were they ambivalent? Were they must have also had tremendous terror of bombs and bullets flying through them and their houses. They might have had some sense of divided loyalties. And I'm wondering if you know what the attitude of Israeli Arabs was in May and then again in June.
It's a great question. Bear in mind that the Arab-Israeli community had been under military rule until 1966. So 1967 is a very tenuous moment for them. They're just beginning to explore the possibility that they really might be part in some way of Israeli society. And then this happens. Now, what you do see in May 67 is a strong sense of kind of demonstrative volunteerism among Arab Israelis as well as Jewish Israelis. Giving blood, volunteering to deliver the mail. They said that the mail was, there were so many volunteers to deliver the mail that the mail was being delivered like 3 times a day in May 67. And so Arab Knesset members, we're really talking about from the Rakach party, the Communist Party in those years, were demonstratively patriotic Israelis. That was the Communist Party, is a signatory to the Declaration of Independence. In those years, this was not considered to be a contradiction, quite the opposite. Now, what happens in 1967 is Arab Israelis are reuniting with their cousins, with their families, from whom they'd been forcibly separated. And so it's a very ambiguous moment. There's the occupation, but there's also a kind of a restoration happening. And I think that duality really characterizes the Arab-Israeli, Palestinian-Israeli experience all the way through. There's no simple answer to how Palestinian Israelis responded, how it affected them. I would say, in retrospect, that's the moment, the 1960s, the end of military rule, when Arab Israelis begin to become culturally Israeli, and 1967 is the moment when many of them begin to become politically Palestinian. So they're becoming Israeliized and Palestinianized almost simultaneously. And we see that today in the polls. You know, there was a fascinating poll taken recently. 52% of Arab Israelis say they're proud to be Israeli. Now, that's a stunning number. It also means that 48% are not. That's a very high number for citizens. And many of those in the 48% don't see themselves as Israeli in the most remote sense. I once interviewed one of the Arab Knesset members, and I asked him, what was your most Israeli moment? And I expected him to talk about a sports team. And he said, I never had an Israeli moment, a Knesset member. And I once interviewed the first and last Arab Knesset member to be accepted in the Knesset's Security and Foreign Affairs Committee, which is where the security secrets are discussed. And I asked him, which Israeli military actions do you consider to be self-defense from 1948 till now? And he said none. He said there's not a single Israeli military act that was ever committed in self-defense. I said, what about the Entebbe rescue? He said, well, if there wouldn't be an occupation, there wouldn't have been a need to hijack, and so there, etc. So now this was a member of the Committee for Security and Foreign Affairs. So we're talking about a very complicated relationship, and 67 only made things much more complicated for Arab citizens.
So, Moshe, why don't you just grab a microphone?
As someone who is very much interested in understanding the personality of what a Jew is, I see you have spoken very briefly about how a personhood or an identity of a personhood is contrived. You also then went on to say that manic depression plays into that. My question was, as I was hearing that, is if we look at the Torah, it's manic depression that mirrors manic depression. It sort of is like the attitude that plays out of the Torah itself. Why is there such a discussion? And then if you look at say God and say the politics surrounding the 67 war and 73 war, it's almost blurring the lines between the two, between what is God and what is war. Why is there not a more emphasis on, say, that aspect of emotionality when there's more emphasis on the outcomes? It sort of seems like we're looking at the symptoms, but we're not looking at the thing that the symptoms come from.
Could you just explain what you mean by where the symptoms come from?
Meaning that the symptoms are obviously coming from a deeper and rooted psychological condition within the Jew or within the emotionality of the Jew than what it is in terms of only the outcomes of, say, war or, say, blurring the lines between politics and God.
In other words, is there something inherent in the Jewish persona that will lead us to a kind of a manic depressive state?
Or beyond that, could this manic depressive state, because we're not talking about it, because we're not addressing it as much as what we are addressing, say, the wars and etc., could we inevitably lead to failure because we are not addressing the manic depressive problem?
Sorry?
Reminiscent of Tal Becker this afternoon, as he was discussing the continued failures of the peace talk, that behind that there's some unaddressed issues of two traumatized peoples. I think people can sort of help me out with that, but I think that was some of what Tal was suggesting.
Yeah, I think that the traumas explain our traumas explain half of the problem, but the other side, we're not alone here. And I would go back to what you were raising before. I think that's one of the fatal flaws in the arguments made by people like Tom Segev, is they deal with only our traumas, only our part of the responsibility, and tend to look at the other side as being irrelevant. And I would say that that's true. It's something that the right and the left has shared in Israel. In that the settlement movement and the peace movement in the 80s, the 90s, really felt that what matters is what we do. For the settlement movement, what matters is we need to stake our claim, we need to establish facts on the ground, and somehow reality will adjust. And the peace movement had the opposite position, but from the same mindset, which is all that matters is our willingness to make concessions. And I remember on the eve of Camp David in July 2000, I ran into a friend of mine, and a journalist from Haaretz, a prominent journalist, I won't mention his name, who was close at that time to circles around Ehud Barak. And he says to me with a big smile, it's a done deal. Barak is going to Camp David. He's going to offer a Palestinian state. He's going to offer redividing Jerusalem, uprooting dozens of settlements. So of course there's going to be a deal. And I said, are you sure? Is Arafat really going to go for a deal? And he said, well, of course he will. We're making the deal. So in the minds of people like my friend, it's all up to us. If we're ready to make the necessary concessions, then of course the deal that we think is reasonable, of course the other side will think it's reasonable too. Well, what if the other side isn't really looking at 1967 as the problem to be solved, but 1948? So I'm wary of putting too much responsibility on our traumas, because again, putting too much on us is something that both left and right have a history of doing.
Shlomit, you get what will have to be the last question. It's not that late. You have a gift for brevity.
Okay, then my question is about agency and the sense of responsibility and more responsibility that results from it. Both the low of extreme vulnerability and the height of achievement, when it's seen as a miracle, basically divorce a person from a sense of their own agency, their ability to affect changes in the world. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, and about, again, linking it to what Tal Becker said, the fact that we seem to be in a stalemate. On the one hand, Israel and Israelis are extremely active. We keep doing things in the world. We're creating settlements, creating movements, creating economics. I mean, we're very active. And yet, when it comes to the situation with the Palestinians, there is a sense, a psychological sense of we can't do anything. And even when we're saying we can't do anything and we need to use power to protect ourselves, our sense is we are forced to use power. There's even a sense of powerlessness in the fact that we use violence to the extent that we need to. So there's this sense. And
yeah, I would say that the consequences, the political consequences of viewing our history through a miraculous lens is much worse than forfeiting agency. It is feeling compelled to act out a certain politics that results from your understanding of what you're required to do as a result of miracle. And so we have Gush Amonim, we have the a deterministic politics, which is very active, but very passive in a certain way too. Do you want to add something? And I very much like your formulation about Israelis as being extraordinarily active and at the same time feeling helpless. And of course, the feeling of helplessness is exactly what Zionism set out to address. So there's something deeply anti-Zionist in that sense of helplessness. I would just say that maybe to tie in some way with Tal's conversation, I didn't hear it, but I've heard it. I was there. And what I've learned in working on the Muslim project that we have here at the Machon is a deeper appreciation for the psychological roots of the conflict. And on our side, I would say that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is so deep because it touches on the two deepest wounds within both peoples. For us, it's the wound of lack of legitimacy. The fact that we still have to defend our right to exist. That term, right to exist, is so galling for the Jewish sensibility that it has poisoned, for us, it has poisoned the conflict. And we should not be in a position where we need to be defending the legitimacy, our indigenousness, our right to be here, rather than debating policies. And that is those are the terms of the conflict that the Arab world set up from the beginning. And that was one of the fatal mistakes that the Arab world made, and it's had the result of inciting the worst instincts within the Jewish people. So that's on our side. On the Palestinian side, and more broadly the Arab and Muslim worlds, their great trauma is colonialism and the sense of helplessness, that others are determining their lives. And we recently had a seminar about the Six-Day War for graduates of our program. And it was quite extraordinary because the Jews, on the Jewish side, we were talking about how this was one of the most uplifting moments of our lives. And on the Muslim side, they were talking about how they still haven't recovered from 67. And even those who were too young to have been alive in 67 have inherited that sense of shame and failure, that in some way the defeat of the Arab world in 67 was the embodiment of the civilizational failure of the Muslim world. And then the settlements are the expression of rubbing salt into the wound. We will tell you where we want our borders. We will tell you where we will live, and you will not be able to stop this. Even when we have a peace process with you, we will continue to be settling. So each side has inadvertently, or is there a word, vertently, pressed the deepest wounds of the other and created a pathological conflict that I think can really only be solved by psychologists and theologians. So that's, is that, yes, I've actually heard Tal say something similar. Now I do it, so I've borrowed that from Tal. So I personally think we need both, because there's no way to deal with this conflict without the religious dimensions, but that's inshallah. Thank you all very much.
I just wanted to say that I've done you an injustice. I claimed that one of the most memorable events in your life was the sit-in in Moscow in front of the Moscow immigration office. But I think singing Hatikva in front of the Satmar Rebbe's house surely topped that. So thanks so much.